And here we go. We are live in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am so grateful to have Elly Griffiths on the show with us today. She has a collection of short stories. It's titled The Man in Black and Other Stories. It's been out for a couple of months now. And Elly, I'm so sorry that we weren't able to connect at the end of last year when the book came out, but so glad that you were gracious enough to join us today. So, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. No, it's great to be here anytime.
Uh, um, Elly, well, first off, let's just go ahead and get this out of the way. Elly is actually a pen name. Um, what what drove you to take up a pen name and to publish under your real name and your pen name? What was the thinking there?
Well, it's quite a strange story in some ways because my real name's Domenica De Rosa. If you want to give it a nice Italian flourish, Domenica De Rosa. My dad was Italian. And Domenica De Rosa actually it means Sunday of the Rose. So it has a really nice meaning. And I
Yeah.
always wanted to be a writer, since almost before I could write. And I always thought that having a really kind of unusual name would be a big asset, really. And I practiced my signature with like a big D and a big R and all that.
Love it.
And actually, eventually, I was published under that name. So I published 4 books, all kind of about sort of Italy, family, relationships, that sort of thing. And all as Domenica De Rosa. And then I had an idea for a crime novel. And my agent said to me, she said, I think you need a crime name. And the reason for that was that, first of all, she thought, and I suppose rightly, that Domenica De Rosa sounds very romantic. It sounds like a romantic author. And she
Is that
thought,
such a bad thing?
well, I know. What's wrong with some romance?
Right,
And the other
right.
thing she thought, which was quite funny, was she thought that Domenica De Rosa sounded made up. And so she was kind of asking me to make up a name that sounded more real, which is
That's
really
hilarious.
strange, isn't it? So without
Well, you're
thinking,
like, well, my parents made it up. That's
well, I know, and I guess in Italy it's not so unusual. I mean, De Rosa is a very common surname
right.
actually in Naples, which is where my dad was from. Domenica's still a bit unusual there. But anyhow, without thinking too much about it, I picked my grandmother's name on my mum's side. So my mum was English and her mother was called Elly Griffiths. So, I just thought I would be it for just that one book, really. So
Yeah.
I thought, let's try Elly Griffiths. And I remember my editor said, let's say Elly because it's a bit tidier, looks a bit neater. So it suddenly became Elly Griffiths. But I thought, if I was published again, it would be as Domenica. But those books, thank goodness, they took off. They were the Ruth Galloway novels. And now I've written 30 books as Elly Griffiths.
Wow, that is
strange, isn't it?
I mean, strange, but amazing at the same time. Like you don't always get to choose the good fortune that comes your way.
That's so true, actually.
Right.
Another thing that's quite amused me a little bit is that those original books, the Domenica De Rosa books, have been out of print, but my publishers have brought them back into print. And on the front, in big letters, it says Elly Griffiths writing as Domenica De Rosa. And that is
writing
kind
as
of
my actual self. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
That's so funny. So 30 books in the Ruth Galloway series?
There are 15 Ruth books,
Okay.
but then the rest are from other series. There's the Brighton Mysteries and the Harbinder series and a few children's books as well. So yeah,
Gotcha.
30 books.
Well, 15 books in the Galloway series is amazing. Most people conjure up, a handful of characters and think of an adventure to send them on, or we like to say that storytelling is really creating a character that readers love, giving them something to strive for, and then throwing everything you can imagine in their way that keeps them from getting what they want. But I think very few people, when they're writing that one story or that first story, it would be difficult for them to think 15 books down to what else can I do to these characters? What can I give? What other kind of things can I give them to want and then fight them from getting? When you first started writing Ruth Galloway, could you see this growing to the place where it has? And could you imagine it?
Well, not really, I have to
Yeah.
say. And you're so right about, you create a character and the character comes to you, and that's great. And you give them things to overcome. That's the whole sort of essence of the story, and
Right.
antagonists and protagonists and all that. And I really honestly didn't know that it would be such a long story, but I did kind of know that there was a long story there, because
Mm,
Ruth has a relationship with the detective who's called DCI Nelson. And I just knew it was a complicated relationship. So I knew in a way that the relationship would take a long time, but I wasn't sure I'd get the chance to write it. And I actually feel so lucky that I have had the chance to write it, because so many people have these ideas for their characters and they want to sort of tell what happened next and what happened next. And that's the thing as well about crime, isn't it, or any genre fiction, is you do sometimes get the chance to write a series, which you probably don't in literary fiction.
right.
But there is always that thing, isn't there, that you can end a story, say, on a cliffhanger, and if it's a one-off or a standalone, you can leave it there. But in a series, you have to say, well, what happens the next day, and then what happens next, and that's quite challenging, but
Yeah.
I've loved doing it, and I think it has made it a sort of richer story. And then the cast, who in the first book, in The Crossing Places, there's really just, there's Ruth and Nelson, and we just know the other detectives by name, but by book 15 they've got their own story arcs and their
Right.
own families and their own relationships and their own problems. So I must say, I really did feel it was a privilege to do that.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the complicated relationship between your main character and DCI Nelson, what a it's almost an art to stretch out that relationship and to give it the room to breathe and to become what it went on to become. I think a lot of um, a lot of times we want to kind of rush through, solve all the problems. Every relationship in our book needs to have a 3-act structure, and we need to land on a positive at the end, and tie up all of the loose ends and put a pretty bow on everything. Um, how do you think about kind of the complex nature? And I like the way that you said that of this relationship, and that things don't have to wrap up in every book. We can continue to see things unfold. Like, how do you think about relationships in terms of 400-page novels?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
you're right. There is a kind of temptation to wrap things up, and I think in a way that's one reason why people like crime fiction, is because there's usually some sort of resolution at the end. But in terms of the private lives of the characters, there isn't always that resolution. Actually, I think it did help that I didn't have a very good, clear idea about where they would end up. So in a way, it made it a bit more organic. I wasn't sure at the end of each book where I knew that I would solve the mystery, or somebody would solve the mystery, and then I would kind of tell the readers who did it.
Yeah.
But I wasn't sure where Ruth and Nelson were going to go. And sometimes I sort of was frustrated with them myself, thinking, oh no, what's going to happen now? And how are they going to move on from there? So even when I was writing book 15, which I did know would be the last one for now, I keep saying, I haven't
Yeah.
said forever, but for now. Even when I was writing it, and I wrote the sort of last scene with Ruth and Nelson, my editor, when she read it, wrote in the margin, "So you went there." I wasn't sure whether you would, and I wasn't sure either, but in the end I did.
I love it. I love it. I have a strange habit when I begin a new writing project, whether it's going to be a novel or a lot of times I don't even know what it's going to be. I just have an idea for a character, and I have an idea of some weird situation that I want to stick them in and see how they respond, that I'll start writing um, sometimes 2 or 3 chapters of just kind of exploring this character, seeing who they are, what their voice is like. A lot of times they'll reveal things about themselves to me. And I know this sounds psychotic when, writers are the only people that can have conversations like this, where we have conversations with the voices in our head, and, we put it down on paper and they become real people. And, they just live between the covers of this book. But, all that aside, and I've tried to talk about this before, and I know I come across as a crazy person that just, talks about the way I explore stories in the beginning. And then I'll get to a point 2 or 3 chapters in where I was like, okay, now I understand this character, or at least understand where to begin with them. And then I'll start kind of plotting out, and I use that term loosely because I'm somewhere between a plotter and a pantser. And so I kind of sketch it out. But then when I heard a few months ago that you had this book, The Man in Black, and that your creative process, that this is a collection of stories that came a bit like my process, it sounded like to me, like these are kind of character sketches of things that you wanted to explore a character and see what, like, first off, before we get into the collection, tell me about that process for you. What do you use? What kind of role does the writing, like this collection of stories we're reading, what is that? Where in the process is that for you, and how do you use that?
That's I totally relate to you. Don't think you sound psychotic at all, because sometimes that's it, isn't it? Sometimes you just have the voice in your head, or
Yeah.
sometimes you just have even the name. I've had a name in my head and thought, I really want to write about that person. I'm not sure where they're going to go, and I'm not sure what sort of story they'd be in. The heroine of my children's books is a girl called Justice, and I was on a train, and I suddenly thought, oh, what about somebody called Justice? Why would they be called Justice? Who would their parents have been? And this kind of girl detective came into my head, and she does appear in the short story collection. So I totally can relate to that process. And actually, in a way, it's quite a good way to think of it, is that the short stories are all these voices in my head, coming out in little vignettes or little scenes. And I think also it's when you have a cast of characters you've written about, sometimes you want to write about them in a place where you haven't in the longer form. So, for example, there's a couple of stories about Ruth at Christmas, which for some reason I never cover her at Christmas in the books. And there's a story about Justice, my schoolgirl heroine grown up, and Max Mephisto, my magician from the Brighton Mysteries, as a young man. So you can see them at different points in their life. But I have to say, for me as well, in some ways, the greatest triumph was to sneak past my editor a story written from the point of view of Ruth's cat. Because I always, my editor is lovely. I've had the same editor, Jane Wood, for all my Elly Griffiths books, and she's amazing. But she doesn't like me getting too soppy about the animals. She doesn't like me anthropomorphizing too much. And I'll say in the book, Flint was feeling bored, and Jane will say, he's not bored, he's a cat. But we all know cats get bored. So I thought it'd be really fun to write a short story looking at Ruth and all her adventures from the point of view of her cat Flint. So that was one voice I really wanted to tell.
So when you're writing these stories, do you think of them as stories for publication? Is this just for your edification? Is this part of your process? Is there a thought in the back of your head? Well, I'll just collect this, and one day I'll have enough stories for a collection. Like how do you think of them? And as a professional writer with 30 books published, when every time you sit down at the keyboard, there's a certain point that when I sit down at the keyboard, this is work. This needs to be something that will ultimately, add to my body of work. It's like writer. It's a funny thing because writers don't, once you kind of reach a certain place, you don't get to write for the hobby of it anymore sometimes, because, everything has to have a purpose. It has to, drive my career forward. And do you get to write for the fun of it? And where do these short stories fall on that spectrum of fun versus work? or do you even think of it in those terms?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think actually that was one of the lovely things about these short stories, because I have collected them over the years,
Yeah.
and a lot of them were not really necessarily for publication. Just to think, oh, it'd be nice to write a little thing about them there. So they didn't at all feel like work. And like you say, the best one in the world, sometimes it does feel like work, doesn't it? When you've got a deadline and you've got to
Sure.
you've got to meet it, and you've got to come up with something. And actually, because this has taken a little while, they didn't feel like work. And there's a really brilliant quote from, and I think it's Laurie Moore. She said, a novel is like a marriage, but a short story is like an affair.
I saw
And
that quote the other day. That's
I
funny.
know, I really love that, because in a way, it feels a little bit daring to write a short story, and you have a little bit of that frisson that maybe, obviously, I don't know this from personal fact, but maybe that feels a bit like an affair. For example, with Ruth, I've written 15 books about Ruth. I've written about her in summer, winter, spring, going through sort of various things. But these little moments that I had with her in this book, in the short stories, felt very different. For example, they go off to Egypt, Ruth and Nelson, which was felt really like going on a holiday myself. And it was like a kind of Agatha Christie Death on the Nile feel. And I could
Right.
take Ruth and Nelson to Egypt. How lucky is that? So I think there was a way in which the short stories, obviously, when I realized they were going to be in a collection, I had to sort of tighten them up and sharpen them up a bit. But there was a way in which actually they felt like, having a little adventure.
Love that. You mentioned earlier the story, from the perspective of the cat, and this collection, you do have some, you kind of cross themes and kind of subgenres in this. You dip into a little cozy mystery, which I think is probably what your editor is worried about, with bringing in the cat. Oh, this is going to
Yes,
be a
yeah.
little too
Bit
cozy
too
mystery
cozy,
or
yeah.
something. You know, but you dip into other areas too. How fun is it to just kind of stretch out and just let your imagination run wild again?
It's really fun, isn't it? That is one of the fun bits of it.
Yeah.
And they're not all crime. As you say, there are a couple of ghost stories. I really do
Yeah.
like a ghost story, so I really enjoyed that. And there's a short story that's really just a homage to Louisa May Alcott and Little Women, which I
Sure.
really enjoyed writing. And there's another one that starts with prehistoric footprints. It's the oldest human footprints outside Africa were found on the east coast of Britain, in Norfolk. So I wanted to write about those people, those prehistoric people, all that time ago. So my husband's an archaeologist, so that kind of
Oh,
helps with those little details. But yeah, it really did feel like a chance to cross genres a little bit, write some things that weren't crime, things that maybe were a bit more like ghost stories. As you say, there's a kind of more cozy mystery aspect to some of them, and some are quite dark. I think there's a short story called Articulation. That's one of my darkest stories, just sneaked in there,
just
between the cozier stuff.
Oh, we got a great comment here from Sano Chun 28. When I was young, I wrote a murder story from the point of view of my cat. I love it.
I want to read that story. I think
I
that's
know.
because cats see everything, and
Right.
my cat is very judgmental, so I'm pretty sure he would solve the crime so quickly. So keep at it.
Yeah, I think the correction is all cats are judgmental.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think they
I
are.
can't speak for them, but I think we all
And
know.
we
Yeah.
can't speak for them because that's what they're like. But yes,
Right.
I
Right. A question from Mizelle71. Hi, Ellie. What prompted you to create Harbinder?
Oh, hi, Mazel. Well, she was one of those characters who did just suddenly appear. So it was in a book called The Stranger Diaries, which
I
was
remember.
first of all intended to be a standalone. It was my first standalone. So I was really excited about it. And it was going to be kind of a little bit ghosty. It was like sort of modern Gothic, and a
Yeah.
series of murders that are based on a Victorian short story, which I made up. And the woman who teaches about this short story also writes a diary, and you start to see that the murderer is writing in the diary. So that was the whole premise of it. But of course, when the first murder happens, I've got to have a detective. And
Sure.
then suddenly in comes the detective. And I think the first thing she says is, well, let's assume I'm in charge. And I thought, oh, okay, right, okay. I want to hear more from this person. You were talking, Hank, about the voice, and that was her voice. And I thought, well, who is she? Well, she's British Indian. She's from a Sikh family. She's gay. She lives at home with her parents at the age of 35. She's out to her colleagues, not necessarily to her parents. And there she was, Harbinder Kaur, this very kind of sort of fully formed character, and she was a lot of fun because she, again, like a cat, really was quite judgmental and quite sharp. It's quite fun to write about a sharp character, but I was very aware as well that she came from a very different cultural background to mine. But luckily, I do have a friend who is from a Sikh family like Harbinder, and I gave her she was kind of my sensitivity reader, my accuracy reader, and her mum too gave me lots of advice on the food. And I did find that there were quite a few links between Italian families and Indian families, and food was a big link. So, but I just thought, Harbinder would be there for that one book. And as I say, she was a fun character to write. But when that book was over, I remember that the great Scottish crime writer Val McDermott read an early copy, and she said to me, I'm not going to do the accent, though she's got a great accent. She said, oh, are we going to hear more from Harbinder? And I said, I don't think so, Val, because that was a standalone. And she said, Harbinder's got more to say. And she was right. So there are 4 books about her now.
Wow. I love that so much. We when I spoke to you just a minute before we went live, and we talked about this short story challenge that we're having in March, where we're gonna as a group write short stories, and I've been talking to some folks in our group about the importance of learning the form of the short story, and how, as a novelist, learning to tell a story in a more confined space with less time with the characters. Confined is a thing that I keep coming back to. Like, it's it forces you to get to the heart of the matter, really.
Yes,
do you think in writing short stories, is there a different approach to it? And maybe first, before we get into that, in your novel writing, do you consider yourself a planner or a pantser, or are you on the spectrum somewhere, like I see most of us? But how do you approach novel writing to begin with?
I think, like you, Hank, I'm a bit in between, really. But I've moved towards the pantser side. So when I first started writing, I did do a kind of chapter plan, and I sort of did just a few lines per chapter, but I went right to the end, so I knew I was going to do it. I knew who did the murder, and why, basically. But funnily enough, just talking about this, the Stranger Diaries, that was the first book where I didn't do that. I didn't write down a plan, and I knew roughly what I wanted to happen, but I allowed myself to be a bit looser with it, and to sort of be a bit more labyrinthine, a bit more sort of serpentine, and go off down sort of strange alleyways and things. And I felt that really helped with the plot, because it's actually probably my most complicated plot, and I didn't write anything down. So from then on, I have been much looser in my planning. I have a vague idea, but I don't always know who did it. I don't always know why. I just trust that that's going to happen along the way. So I think I have moved somewhere along that spectrum. But to go back to your point about short stories, well, as you say, that is different, because it's you don't have that many words. I don't know, are you going for a sort of time limit in your collection?
We're going to probably 5,000 to 8,500 words, kind of, that sweet spot in there, not just under 10,000,
I think that's a really good length, actually. I think that's a really good length. And I think you do have to be a little bit tighter with it, and sort of think a bit. So many short stories have things happen in threes, don't they? Like Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs, that with the 3 wishes. And there's a reason why that happens, I think, because that feels quite a natural way to tell a short story. But I think the other thing you have to think about is the ending, because a short story doesn't have to have a twist. It doesn't have to have like a plot twist, but it has to have something, and it could be an emotional twist, can't it? But I think that's the other thing to think about, really, is to condense the form a little bit, which is quite challenging, but also really enjoyable, I think, to do. And of course, if you're writing a crime novel, a crime short story, it's quite challenging because you have to get the clues in there, but they can't be too obvious.
Right.
And you don't have so many pages to hide them. So all those things are fun to do. But I think definitely think about the structure, think about maybe things happening in threes, and think about that ending.
Yeah. When I'm thinking about novel writing, I'm thinking in terms of a character and their growth. I'm thinking in terms of how this plot that I've envisioned is going to happen to this character, is going to invade their life, and you know what that's, you know, the up and down of the arc of the story. I'm thinking in those kind of terms.
Mm.
When I think about a short story, I'm thinking usually about an emotional impact. I'm thinking about a certain emotion that I want to leave with the reader.
Mm.
You know, when they spend 30 minutes with me reading this story, I want them to feel something at the end. I don't want them to necessarily feel like they've been on a pleasant adventure that has an up and down and leaves them content at the end. I want them to feel something. Does that make sense to you at all? And do you think in terms like that about the difference in how a short story versus a novel resonates with the reader?
Yeah, and I think somebody once described it as exit music. And I think
Mm,
that's a really nice way to look at it, is
yeah,
how you want people to feel afterwards. And I think you're exactly right in that it doesn't have to have a lot happening in a short story, does it? But I think that there maybe has to be that moment that makes you think, or and even just could be an image that stays with you. If you think about the yellow wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, I guess that imagery of the woman confined in the room with the yellow wallpaper stuck with me far longer than many a really long book that I've read. It's that,
yeah,
and the signalman, Charles Dickens, and then the signalman look out below there with his lantern. That image really stays with you, and that's such a clever story because things happen
right,
in threes, and really everything's foreshadowed from those very first words. But I think, yes, I think that's true. I think that's something a short story can do really well, even if it just leaves you with one very arresting image. I think
right,
that does work well in short stories. I mean, if you think about Stephen King's short stories, they have sparked whole massive films, haven't they?
right.
The Shawshank Redemption was based on, was it Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank
Yes, I think it
Redemption?
was Rita Hayworth in the Shawshank
Yes,
Redemption. Yeah,
but you think it's a short, it's a novella, it's a long short story, and it
yeah,
makes a really satisfying film. So, yeah, I think short stories do that quite well. Plant an image, in our heads, or a feeling, as you say. It doesn't have to be an image; it can be a feeling.
right. Do you generally know that when you're starting on a short story that this is a short story, that you're going to pursue it to that point, or is it just a new thing that you're writing to find out if it's going to go anywhere? Like when you sit down to start a short story, what expectations do you put on it?
It really depends, actually, because I think some things you don't know how they're going to turn out. Maybe they are
Yeah.
going to turn out to be a short story. I think the one about the woman seeing it's called What I Saw from the Sky, and she sees a murder from a sort of ski lift. And
Yeah.
I sort of had that in my head, really, and I was wondering what it was going to be, and it turned out to be a short story. So, but others, I have sat down and thought I'm going to write a short story. I did want to write a short story about Ruth and Nelson going to Egypt. That's one of the longest short stories in it. I wanted to write one about Max Mephisto and the disappearing landlady. That was in my head to be a short story. So it does depend, really, where you're starting out. Some things you just don't know where they're going to go, but a couple of years ago I was really lucky enough to be asked to write a new short story about Miss Marple, and
Mm.
that was a real challenge because
Oh yeah.
it was great. 12 women writers, not all crime writers, and we were just told that we could write about Miss Marple. We were just told three things. We were told had to be Miss Marple from Agatha Christie's era, so she couldn't be young, basically.
Sure.
So she couldn't be young. She couldn't fall in love, and she couldn't meet Poirot. Which is a bit sad, isn't it, that she couldn't
Oh
fall.
man. Oh.
But given those parameters, we could write anything we liked. And actually, I think they were worried we'd all write the same thing, but we all wrote very, very different things. And I think that was a really unique challenge because it was taking someone else's character, marvelous character, really,
Right.
and but you could do anything with her. And I did send her to the Amalfi Coast in Italy, near where my family are from, and sort of tried to write a story that had that. Because the good thing about Miss Marple is she does get around a lot. She travels when she goes to
That
the
she
Caribbean,
does.
doesn't she?
Yeah.
Her nephew seems to have endless money to send her on trips. So so
God
that
love
again
him.
was, that was something that was very definitely set out to write a certain sort of short story. But within that, you could go anywhere with her, and it was one of the most enjoyable projects I've worked on. Partly also because the other women involved were so lovely. We called ourselves the Marple Sisters, and we just all got on really well.
The Marple Sisters. I love it.
Yeah.
That's so interesting because you writing in someone else's world with their
Yes.
character, there's so much that's already been established, and of course endless opportunities, but how do you stay true to that voice that is so I don't know, so ironclad, so in all our collective consciousness that but you're right, it's so interesting to see 12 different writers dream up new ways to work within those confines, and and beautiful stuff comes out of it. It's
I
amazing.
think that's what's going to be really great about your collection as well. So
I
many
hope.
different writers go approaching things in just different ways, and I think
Right.
it sounds like it's going to be fantastic.
I think it's gonna be great. When do you put well, let's go back for just a second to Ray Bradbury, one of my one of my big influences, talked a lot about writing short stories, and he said that new writers should try to write a short story every week for a
Oh,
year, because and write a new story on Monday, and then edit every day of the week until you get to Saturday, and then start a new one on Monday again. And he said, kind of tongue in cheek, surely you can't write 50 bad short stories,
oh,
if you just keep trying
wow,
at it, and that's kind of tongue in cheek, but he was definitely putting time constraints on it, that you
yeah.
shouldn't spend more than one day writing the first draft, and then the rest of the week is revisions, and so to speak. um
Oh,
do you put time constraints on a short story that you're writing? Do you think, okay, this needs to be done in a very narrow window of time, or are you the kind of writer that will have an idea and write a couple of paragraphs and then leave it, come back a few days later or maybe a month later when another idea comes? Like, how do you think about the actual drafting process of the short story writing?
I hadn't heard that Ray Bradbury, though. I'm a big fan too.
Mhm.
That's so fantastic. Honestly, he was so incredible, really, the
Yeah.
way he went about things. I do usually put like I try and do 1,000 words a day, basically. Um, so at least that. So I guess the first draft, of a 5,000 word um story might take 5 days, I think. But sometimes less, when I find that the first few thousand are harder, but then when you're on the downward slope towards the end, it's much more exciting. So I don't tend to put time limits on it in that way, but I
Yeah.
think maybe I do sort of try and do 1,000 words a day. I try not to do too much redrafting. I do try and trust my first draft as much as possible. Obviously, I do redraft it, but I do try and trust myself that I might have got it right first time. Sometimes we do, don't we? And sometimes we can lose that. So yeah, that's a really great one that you'd write 50 short stories in a year, and you just hope some of them are good. Wow,
Right.
that's amazing.
Speaking of your story, where Ruth and company go to Egypt, um, did you know that that was going to be a short story? Like, do you ever wonder, like, is this idea, is it novel worthy, or do I want to just show the story through one glimpse through the window? Which is kind of what a short story is. It's not watching a movie. It's glimpsing through a narrow window and getting a snapshot
I love that. I love that image. That's a really lovely image.
I just pulled it
Um,
off the top of my head. I
That's really
don't.
good. I wanted that to be a long short story, so I suppose that kind of was
Okay.
in my head, and I wanted it to be, because in this book I wanted at least one story. The thing about that story is called The Valley of the Queens, is that it takes Ruth and Nelson on from the end of The Last Remains, which is the last Ruth book. So I want to be able to have, like you say, like a glimpse through the window of their life afterwards. But I think it could have been a full-length novel, and sometimes you don't know, do you? Sometimes you think, wow, this is a book, this is an idea that could sustain a whole book, and it actually doesn't. You don't know why, but it just doesn't. And another times, a smallish idea, really. The whole Ruth series started with a chance remark of Andy's, my husband, who we were walking across marshland in Norfolk, and he said that prehistoric people thought marshland was sacred because it's neither land nor sea, but something in
Right.
between. They thought it was a bridge to the afterlife, neither land nor sea, neither life nor death. And that little, that little idea
Hmm.
really became the whole book, The Crossing Places, and became the start of the series. So sometimes it's a little thing, isn't it? And
Yeah.
sometimes you think all these massive things and it still doesn't sustain a book, but it could make a really satisfying short story. So it's a fascinating, I don't think I've worked it out yet, but it is an interesting sort of alchemy, isn't it? You don't
Yeah.
always know.
Right. And I think about marshlands, but also beaches where
Yes,
tides come and go, and
yes,
um,
liminal
sun up,
areas.
sundown, the time between times. The
Heard it
there's
once
so much
described.
magic just
Yes,
embedded in that. That's just
and
waiting for stories to be uncovered.
definitely, and sort of frontiers and borders,
Mhm.
and somebody once described them as the thin places.
Right.
Where
Yeah.
that little membrane between our world and other worlds might be a bit thin. I love all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Me too. That's kind of the essence of the kind of stories that I love to write,
yes,
are the
yeah,
reality but there's something just out of reach
a
that's
little bit
odd going
uncanny.
on. Yes, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
We've got a great question here. I love the idea of writing new stories using other people's characters. Are there any other characters out there, Ellie, you'd like to write a story about? What a provocative question.
What a great
Yeah.
question. And I feel I need more time to think about it. But off the top of my
Right.
head, one of my favorite writers is Wilkie Collins, and I'm very influenced by him. And you can see the influence, I think, of The Woman in White and The Moonstone in my books. And in The Moonstone, it's sometimes called the first English detective story because it has this amazing character called Sergeant Cuff in it. And he's now when you read it, you think, oh, he's got all those detective tropes, but actually Collins was the first one to write about them. So he comes in, he's sort of humming a song. He doesn't really talk about the case. He talks about his roses. He's this really interesting character, and you never quite know what he's thinking. And of course, nowadays, Wilkie Collins's editor would say, right, Wilkie, we need another 10 books about him, but he only appears in that one book. So I wouldn't mind writing about Sergeant Cuff. I think he's got more to tell us, and he's got this backstory. We don't really know very much about him. He loves roses. He loves growing roses. That's one of the things we know about him. And he's a very compassionate man. He's obviously kind of a working class man who's become a detective and is in this stately home and has the nerve to ask, Lady Verinder questions. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are others, but I would love to write a Sergeant Cuff story.
Well, and
Great question.
with a name like DeRosa, that it's
Yes,
meant for you to write
it's
that
the
story.
roses. Oh yes, it
Right.
is. I hadn't thought of that, Hank. Yes, I'm
Right.
born to write that
You're
story.
born to write it. You know what? You just need to do it, Ellie, and just
Thank
take
you.
it from there. Um, if Going back to Bradbury for just a second, he said that new writers should start writing short stories. I feel like that the way the market is now, people are expected to start writing novels, and then sometimes they get the opportunity, like you did, to collect a series of short stories that they've done, and it's kind of flipped backward from when he was
Yeah.
writing that, probably in the late 50s, early 60s, maybe, when the market was completely different.
Yeah.
Do
Yes.
you have any feeling about whether someone should cut their teeth doing one type of writing versus the other, or do you even think that that's necessary? Should you just embrace the form that you feel more comfortable at, and then do you think that it needs to come in any certain order, or are there skills that need to be built a certain way?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because there's sort of a tension between what you need to do to build as a writer and what's more likely to be published. And as you said, in Bradbury's time, there were so many more magazines and newspapers
Yeah.
that published long form stories. Dickens was always publishing, serial form, and
Right.
now we don't have that at all. And absolutely, I think first time writers are told, that they set out to write a novel, and it's 80,000 words, 90,000 words. But I think it actually wouldn't hurt, even if it wasn't for publication, to start with writing a short story. I think some of the short form is. I think my very first book was when I was 11, and it was a kind of long short story, and it was called The Hair of the Dog. And it was a murder mystery. And I don't know that I knew what the hair of the dog meant. Maybe my parents talked about it a lot. But it was a kind of Agatha Christie-esque murder mystery. And it did teach me quite a lot about how to, I did finish it. I did bring it to a conclusion. So I think that might be one of the things that writing a short story would teach a new writer. It is how to bring it all together and how to bring it. So I think in some ways I agree with Ray Bradbury, but I do also agree that possibly that isn't the thing that's going to be published. I think you're very lucky if you get to write a short story collection these days, and I'm really lucky that I did. I think people are looking for a full-length novel, really, from a debut writer. Although maybe there are some sort of crime collections that there's usually around sort of things like Bouchercon and things like that. There are crime, so maybe if you're a crime writer, you might get away with the short story.
Yeah, but possibly so. The one thing that I've postulated is that if you're a novelist, learning to write short stories will help your writing in the novel form, and it can seem counterintuitive that these are two completely different forms, and one is trying to tell a story in the using as much brevity as possible, and the other is stretching the story out so that you can take the reader on a journey, and with many ups and downs. Do you feel like there are tools that you can acquire for your writer toolkit that you can draw upon as a novelist that you pick up from writing short stories?
I think so. I really do think so. I think it is that idea about sort of marshalling all the ideas and coming to a conclusion. So I think that can seem impossible. And I used to play chess with my mom. And my mum was a very keen chess player, but she wasn't very good. And she only ever played with me. And in all modesty, I was better than her. So she never got to do a checkmate, because I always checkmated her. And so she never learned how to do that. My poor mum, I should have let her win. No, I shouldn't have. She wouldn't have wanted that. But I suppose that's a similar thing, isn't it? Because if you never get to write an ending, you don't know how to do that. So I think that's something that you could learn. And also, if you are a crime writer, it's the idea about where to put the clues and how to pace that. I think honestly do think writing a short story is very good. Very good practice for writing a long novel, and it's a great thing in itself. But I think you can also see it as teaching yourself, or even writing really short stories, like a couple of thousand words, because you can get quite a lot in there, and maybe trying to do one that's all dialogue or something like that. I think those are kind of fun little tasks to set yourself.
Sure, and you can never disregard the importance of finishing something. And if it's a 2,000 word story, if it's a 5,000 word story, if it's 10,000, kind of micro novel sort of thing, that the writing a beginning, a middle, and an end, and finishing a story, I think does more for a writer's confidence than and then you stretch a little bit and you figure out, okay, I've got this one emotional kernel. Now, how can I expand that and take the reader on more of a journey? And, I don't know.
No, I'm totally with you. I think that's right. And I absolutely agree with you about the importance of finishing.
Yeah.
And, we both see, I'm sure, a lot of people starting books, but few are finishing them. So if you set yourself the task of writing just a short story, then you'll get to finish it. You'll get that wonderful feeling. You'll get that exit music. So I definitely am in favor of practicing a bit on short stories.
Absolutely. Well, The Man in Black is the short story collection by Elly Griffiths. It's called The Man in Black and Other Stories. It's available everywhere now. Go visit your favorite local bookstore and support local books. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put links to it in the show notes where you can order it from Amazon and get it delivered to your house. Elly, Dominica, for folks that are just discovering your work, where's the best place for them to find you and to dig into all the great stuff you're up to?
Well, actually, short stories are probably quite a good way in The Man in Black, but otherwise, I would probably start with The Crossing Places, the first Ruth book, and hopefully that could be the start of that journey. But yeah, that would be lovely if you did.
Excellent. And your website is you're just ellygriffiths.co.uk,
Yes,
right?
Elly Griffiths. And I'm also on other various sort of social media and Facebook and Blue Sky and places like that, Instagram. So, and I love hearing from people. So do send me a message.
Excellent. We'll send everyone to see you. Elly, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today and sharing so graciously with us.
I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.